I fly a lot. I love planes. I think they're really, really cool. I think the technology in them is amazing. And the more I learn about them, the more impressed about planes I am. But here's what's interesting. When you fly as often as I do, you get to your seat, you settle down, you wait for people to board. And then as the plane starts to kind of, go through the taxi through the runway and the airport, what happens? The flight attendants come and they give you their whole safety procedure, you could say, right? And they tell you, maybe it's a TV screen, maybe they're doing it in person, but they tell you, make sure you buckle up here, and this is how you inflate your life jacket, and you breathe into this thing, but don't inflate your life jacket until you're outside of the plane, which is super important for everybody to know. They tell you all of these things, right? Now, here's the problem. When you fly for the first time, you're like, okay, let me make sure I get all that. The second time, you're like, okay, let me make sure. By the third, fourth, fifth, sixth time, you're like, I've heard it already, right? And why does that happen? Well, oftentimes it's because we've already heard it, number one. But number two, it doesn't ever seem to come in handy. It's not like we ever use it, right? We go up and we come down. Like, I know, put my seatbelt on. Yeah, I know, you're supposed to put your life jacket on. And we almost kind of tune it out because we think it's not important to know anymore. By the time you've been flying for the 50th time, you're asleep when they give those safety protocols, right? You're not even paying attention, right? But here is the interesting thing. If something was to happen to the plane, what then would your mind want to go back to? What did she say to do? What was the important thing? What was the protocol? In other words, we didn't think we needed it because it never came in handy. It didn't seem like it had relevance to our lives, so we just tuned it out. But the minute there's turbulence or the minute something goes on, all of a sudden we realize, wait, I need that information. In other words, once we realize that what you're being told impacts your life, that's when you want to pay attention. Oftentimes people say to me, look, Alycia, I really don't see the need for this whole God thing, and my life is fine, and I don't really see how. One person actually said to me recently, how does this bring value to my life believing in Christianity? So in other words, we don't think that religion or the existence of God impacts our lives because it doesn't seem to have any significance based off what we hear or what we've heard in the past. But what if we are wrong? The reality is that whatever we believe in, whether it's Christianity or another religion over here or no religion over here or your own personal religion that you came up with, whatever you believe in impacts your everyday life. It affects your interaction with other people. It affects who you choose to marry. It affects what kind of job you get, what kind of profession you get. It affects all aspects of your life, what you say, what you do, how you think. Well, what do you mean, Alycia? That doesn't seem to make any sense, right? How do these things impact my life? Well, let me just give you some examples. Number one, what you believe determines how you value other human beings, and that is really important. Why? Because the reality is when you look at history and when you look at modern day today, you will see oftentimes, not always, but you'll see oftentimes a common pattern between how what we value, we treasure, and how what we don't value, we harm. And the reality is that for so many people, what we value, we will protect, we will care for, we will nurture. And what we don't value, we will oppress, we will hurt, we will destroy. When you look back in history and you see just examples of oppression, whether you think of World War II or you think of various slave trades that have existed throughout society. And Hitler, by the way, when you got to Auschwitz, they immediately tattooed a number on your forearm. And that became your name. You no longer had the name John Smith. Your name was now a number. And the reason why they did it is because it dehumanized you. No longer were you a name and a human, you were just a number. And the minute you became a number is the minute it was easier for the guards to hurt you and abuse you and mistreat you. In other words, what we see is that when people lower value they abuse it. They abuse the individual they just lowered. And this happens all the time with criminals and within the criminal justice system, and you look at crimes and you look at criminal behavior. A lot of people that commit violent crimes will look at the person they committed the crime against as an object. They actually don't see them as a person. And that psychological twist enables them to go ahead and proceed in harming that individual. So value, what we see about human value and worth is important. Now, for a lot of people, value is fluid, right? How do we determine the value of somebody? Well, for some people, it'll say, well, your value is determined based off maybe your job or profession or what you can bring to us as a society. And I hear that one a lot. Other people will say, well, maybe it is your value is subjective and it's based off of what other people think of you. Well, the problem with these kind of ideas of value is that these ideas of value open yourself up to being devalued very easily. In other words, your value can change based on how people think you are in terms of value to society, or based on what somebody else thinks of you in this particular moment, in this particular time. So you may say you go to be a doctor and you do it, and you're a great, great surgeon. But then something happens where you're no longer able to perform surgery. So you went from being really important to society to no longer being important to society. Or maybe you're an Olympian and you were really, really good at your particular sport. But as age set in and different injuries, you no longer could perform at that level. Well, who are you then? See, it's not just what other people think of you, but it's also what you think of yourself if your value is tied up in things that are external to you. But what about this idea of meaning? What is the idea that, what we believe about the meaning of life impacts how we live life? See, here's what's interesting about the meaning of life is, about 80 or so years ago now, Georges Lamar, who was a French priest, Catholic priest, I believe, made the revolutionary discovery that basically saying this idea that science had been talking about for a while, how the universe was expanding. And he basically just reversed that and says, look, guys, if the universe is expanding, then at some point it would have come to a singular point called a singularity. In other words, if it comes down to a singular point, then that means the universe had a beginning. This is extremely problematic for science at the time because they had believed the universe was always existing. Right? So when it's always existing, you don't have to ask about who created it. But the minute you bring it down to a singularity, a single point, now you have to say, who did that? Who brought this into existence? That meaning changed everything because it meant if the universe is expanding, then at some point it's going to expand so far as science will tell us, and eventually it'll expand to a point where the universe is all going to just be done. It'll collapse, and the forces will be all off, and it won't be able to hold us, and basically everything that we know will be gone. So the question then that we have to then ask ourselves, if we are all going to die into oblivion at some point, then does it ultimately matter if we find the cure for cancer? Does it ultimately matter if I raise people out of poverty? Does it ultimately matter if I reach out and help somebody cross the street? Because we're all going to die anyways. None of it matters. It's like saying, well, look, the ship is sinking, so let me hurry up and do a nice fresh coat of paint as it's going down into the water. That would make no sense. If the universe has a beginning, and if at some point it's going to end, then it doesn't actually matter what we do now. Yeah, it matters personally one-on-one, but in the grander scheme of things, you may have cured cancer, but we're all going to end up dying anyways. So what is our meaning of life? How do we define the meaning of life? What is it that then motivates us to wake up in the morning and to do something, to go to work when it's cold and snowy, or when it's warm and sunny and all you want to do is be outside? Does what you do have meaning? Does what you do have a purpose? Does it have an ultimate goal? Does it matter? Does your work ultimately matter in the larger grand scheme of things? Now, what about this idea of morality? We've looked at how whatever we believe, whatever belief system we have or non-belief system we have, how it shapes how we see the values of humans, how it shapes whether or not we think there's a meaning to life. And we've also seen how, or we can look at right now, how our view shapes what we think about morality, how we should then live. Many philosophers have tried to come up with these ideas of morality, this idea of like, what is the best way that we can help people best know how to treat other people? So there's a variety of different views out there. Of course, utilitarianism is super, super popular, which ultimately says what is morally right is what's good for the greatest number of people. Okay, what's good for the greatest number of people. Part of the challenge with that worldview is then you could then make the argument that slavery is good. You enslave a few small number of people and it benefits a larger number of people. Therefore, slavery is good. Another problem with that view, though, is in order for you to know whether or not something really is good for the greatest number of people, you have to be able to see the future. You have to be able to know, to see 40, 50, 60, 100, 200 years down the line to know whether or not that was good for the greatest number of people. Because what looks good today may not look good in the future. Maybe from a naturalistic perspective, the perspective that doesn't believe in a God at all, and just as a natural physical world is all that there is, and that all of the physical laws that we have can be explained in a natural kind of way. This group would probably say that morality is doing what's best for society. Helping people helps our species to survive. Being kind to people helps our species to survive. Loving people helps our species to survive. Giving food to those who are needy helps our species to survive. But that's not actually true. See, within that framework, giving food to somebody who is in need is actually contrary to a fundamental world where there is no God, which is survival of the fittest. In other words, in a world where there is no God and the whole point is for a species to reproduce and keep its species going for as long as possible, then we want the strongest, the most intelligent, the best people to survive. If I'm helping the weaker, are those the genes that I want to pass on? Within this framework, you lose justification to help the weaker in our species, because the point is you want the strong, wealthy, intellectual people to survive, and it's okay that the weak die out. Do you see the problem with that kind of worldview? That's a horrific way to live life, is to think that I can just let these people go because they're weaker. So once again, doing what's best for society, or saying that like, I can help this one and not help this one, and all of these kind of things, they don't really get us to where we want to go. But additionally, can we once again see the future to know what really is good? If a young woman is raped, and let's say she ends up getting pregnant, we would say, man, that rape is horrific, right? But in the same sense, let's say she gets pregnant and she decides she wants to have the baby. And so she has the baby, and that baby then grows up and finds a cure for cancer and saves a lot of people. Would somebody in this view say that the rape was right or wrong? Or would they say the rape is right because it produced such a good for so many people, so therefore we have to say the rape is okay? So this action that led to some people being saved from cancer, that means it was actually good action? Is that what this group would say? See, within this group, the morality kind of shifts and changes based on the outcomes. If she got pregnant and from the rape and the person had become a criminal, well, we'd say the rape is bad. So is the rape bad or is the rape good? Which is it? Because the morality within this naturalistic, atheistic framework seems to be fluid. It seems to be based off of the outcomes that we perceive. It seems to be based off of the future events that we don't even know when we're making these judgments right now. Several years back, Richard Dawkins was on Twitter, And there was an interesting conversation between him and a woman, and I want to read you what happened. This woman put on Twitter, she wrote, "I honestly don't know what I would do if I were pregnant with a kid with Down syndrome. Real ethical dilemma." Richard Dawkins responded by saying, "Abort it and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice." Now, I'm not trying to get into the whole abortion thing right now. I wanted to focus on the word that he said, immoral. He said it would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice. In other words, he's making a moral judgment. He is saying if you have this child with Down syndrome, then it is immoral, it is wrong. You're committing a moral wrong to bring this child into the world. Why does he say that? Well, he says it because the way people view the value of people with Down syndrome is that they are less than people without Down syndrome. These are less valued people. Once again, like I said before, once you devalue something, it is easier for you to hurt it. And Richard Dawkins goes on to say, because people got upset with him and he defended himself and he didn't change his stance. But he went on to say that most Down syndrome babies are aborted, which is true. Most Down syndrome babies are. So do we feel good about morality? Do we feel like we have a good moral system? Sometimes we think rape is good. Sometimes we think rape is bad. Sometimes we should help the poor, but actually we shouldn't help the poor because they're the weak ones and we want them to die out anyways. Or Down syndrome babies, we should get rid of them because they're devalued. Are you feeling like this is a great worldview to hold? Or at least are you seeing that what we believe impacts how we treat and respond to others? Even if we have no religion, we are still holding certain things to be true. We are still believing in certain things and acting in accordance with them. Some people get their morality from a divine being, and they just say, well, God told me to do this, and that's good, and that's why I do it. Okay, well, that is a possibility as well, as long as you can trust who that God is. That is the key thing. Nothing wrong with getting it from a God, as long as we know we can trust the character of that God. So in other words, everything that we do is shaped by how we live. We may say, I'm not religious, I don't adhere to any of that, but don't think that you haven't created your own ideas and value systems and meaning systems and morality systems that you are functioning out of. The only difference in this particular subject matter, the only difference between a person who's not a believer and a person who is a believer in God is the source to which they get those answers from. That's all that changes. So let me talk to you a little bit about the Christian responses to some of these things. Number one, Christianity would never teach that our value is tied up in what somebody else thinks of us. Christianity would never teach that your value is great if you're a doctor and less if you're not. Christianity would not teach that our value is subjective and kind of go with the tides. Christianity gives you a locked-in value. And here's what it says. Let's say we go to an art museum, okay, and there's a bunch of beautiful paintings on the wall in this art museum. And you walk up to one of them, and you're like, wow, this is amazing. Look how beautiful this is. And you look down, and the name on the art painting is Alycia Wood, me. If somebody walked over and says, I want $3 million for that painting, are you going to pay $3 million for a painting I drew? Probably not. Why? Because who am I? I'm really nobody special, okay? But what if we walked over to that painting and on the bottom of that painting it said Chagall, or it said Raphael, or whatever, some other famous artist that you love? Would you then pay $3 million for it? Now, of course, you may not have $3 million to pay, but the point is, would it seem like it actually would be worth $3 million with their name on it versus my name on it? In other words, the value of a painting is determined by how much somebody's willing to pay for it. And what determines how much somebody's willing to pay for that painting is the name that is written on that painting. Christianity sees value in the same way. Whose name is written on you? Who is it that gives you value is the artist that made you. It is your creator that made you and that gives you value. So your value is not based off of whether or not you become a doctor. Your value is not based off of whether you become an Olympian. Your value isn't tied up in any of these things. It cannot change because that name is always imprinted on you. That matters because it means that we don't have the right to ever devalue somebody because I never created their value in the first place. If I created their value because they had some really great profession like a doctor or Olympian, I could choose to devalue them. But I didn't give humans their value. It comes from their creator. And so I don't get to devalue them and I don't get to abuse them. What is the idea of meaning? Does Christianity have anything to say about meaning in our lives? Well, it does. Surprise, surprise. It says that actually it does matter what you do. Yes, eventually this world will not be here. But what you do does matter because the God who made this world sees everything that you do, sees that there's value in what you do. And it brings him joy when you are living in this world that he's created you to be in, and you're experiencing it and you're enjoying all the different aspects and things that it has, and how you are caring for other people and how you are serving other people. All of those things mean something to the God who created this world. Let me see if I can give you a quick illustration about this to make it a little bit simpler to understand. Imagine that for Christmas, a father wants to make a barn, a little toy wooden barn for his son. So the father makes the barn and wraps it all up and gives it to the son. On Christmas Day, the son rips open that paper and sees the barn and it's like, wow, Dad, thank you so much. And maybe the boy's like, what do I do with this? And Dad says, well, there's no paint on it. Maybe you should paint it. So the boy paints it just the way he wants it. He makes it beautiful. He makes it so pretty. And then he's like, well, Dad, what do I do with it next? And maybe the dad's like, well, how about you maybe make a little room inside there that you could put the animals? And so the boy grabs his toys and uses different paper and different cardboard and things like that to create a little room inside of there. And all of this is bringing the dad joy because he's watching how happy the son is to have taken what Dad made. He put paint on it and made it beautiful. He's using his hands and his skills to create a room within the barn the father had made. And this brings the father joy to watch the son play and utilize the barn house. And they get to do it together. The father's on the floor playing with the son, and together within their relationship, it makes this whole experience so much more beautiful and meaningful. They laugh as they tell stories together. And ultimately, this is why the father creates, is so that the son can experience the father, both with the father one-on-one, but also with the things that the father has made. And in this particular situation, the barn. But here's the thing. The boy has a sister. Wouldn't it be even more joyous for the father and the son if the sister came into play? And so the sister is invited into play, and now she is adding her little touches to the barn, and she's maybe makes a room for her and her animals, and the father is getting such great pleasure out of enjoying working with this barn with his children, and the children are getting such great pleasure out of using their skills and their talents to make the barn better and to do it with the father. And as long as the son and the father and the sister are together and the children are using this barn in the way that the father intended. So, for example, they're using it to store their animals and the father isn't using it to hit his sister over the head. As long as they're using it in the way that the father intended, it will bring joy to the children and to the father. Does your life have meaning? Absolutely. To know God, experience his goodness both in him and in the world that we live in, using our life in servitude to him and his desires, using our talents and using our skills here and now that he has given us to help make things even more beautiful, make things better for people around us and us. And because God designs the barn, he tells us the best way that we can utilize the barn, how it should be treated, how it should be handled with care. Because the Father, as the creator of it, knows how it best is to be used. And what about this idea of morality? Richard Dawkins, in his Twitter comment on Down syndrome, said that it would be immoral to bring this child into the world and that getting rid of it would be the best plan. Well, here's what's interesting. In 2011, in the American Journal of Medical Genetics, they did a study on people with Down syndrome, ages 12 and older. And they asked them about their self-perception so that their information could be shared with new and expectant parents of children with Down syndrome. So they wanted to take this information and use it to help other people who had Down syndrome children. And so here is what they found. They interviewed about 284 young people or people with Down syndrome. And here's what they found. Among those surveyed, nearly 99% of people with Down syndrome indicated that they were happy with their lives. 97% liked who they are. 96% liked how they look. If we were to poll 96% of Canadians, do you think that they would say, or if we polled 100% of Canadians, would 96% of them say they liked how they look? If I was to poll this church, would 96% of the church say they liked how they look? Yet 96% of those with Down syndrome in this study liked how they looked. It says nearly 99% expressed love for their families. 97% liked their brothers and sisters. 86% felt they could make friends easily. And a small percentage expressed sadness about their life. And here's what the article says. It said, in our qualitative analysis, people with Down syndrome encouraged parents to love their babies with Down syndrome, mentioning that their own lives were good. They further encouraged healthcare professionals to value them, emphasizing that they share similar hopes and dreams as people without Down syndrome. So overall, the overall majority of people with Down syndrome surveyed indicated they live happy and fulfilling lives. How many people without Down syndrome would say they live happy and fulfilling lives? When we take value into our hands and we say we will determine what somebody's worth, we can get that wrong. And here Richard Dawkins is saying we should devalue these Down syndrome people and get rid of them. And here we're finding out that they are actually happier than us. This is why we don't put value and meaning and morality in the hands of humans. We put it in a source that is trustworthy. But it's a fair thing, pushback to say to me, well, Alycia, so you get your morality as a Christian from God. How do you know you can trust God? And that's a great question. That's the exact question you should ask me. Because I need to be able to back that up too. If I'm going to say I'm going to trust God, I need to back that up too. Well, let me let you know that long time ago, thousands of years ago, there was an interesting dialogue between Socrates and a guy named Euthyphro. It's famously called Euthyphro's Dilemma. And it's a much longer story, so I'm going to just give you a little bit of a paraphrase of how it goes. But basically, Socrates runs into his friend Euthyphro. Euthyphro is is en route to a trial. And because his father had killed one of his servants. So essentially, the servant had gotten in a fight with somebody else and killed him. The father got mad and bound up the servant's hands and feet and put him in a ditch. When people came back for the servant a couple of days later, he had died. And so basically the father was being charged for murder for binding him up and putting him in the ditch. And Euthyphro was going to trial against his father, saying he should be charged for murder. So Socrates is like, wow, like you are, the person that your father murdered must have been somebody really close to you, like a relative. Because you would never have thought of prosecuting your father if it was somebody that was not a relative. And Euthyphro was like, actually, yeah. And so tells him the story and says, yeah, this person was not my relative at all that died. And so Socrates is struggling to understand why Euthyphro would prosecute his father. Why do you feel like your father is so guilty of murder? Like, shouldn't you make an exception because he's your father? And so this leads to a discussion about what is morally right and what is morally wrong to do. So eventually Socrates then says this, and here's where the dilemma starts. He says, this is what I wonder. Are things good because God tells us they're good? Or do we do good things because good things exist and God is just telling us what the good things are because we don't have the ability to know what the good things are ourselves? So he presents these two things. Do we do what's good because God says it's good? Or do we do good things because good things exist apart from God and he's just telling us what the good things are and so we're doing them? And the reason why this is a dilemma is because there's problems with both of those views. If we do good things just because God tells us, then God says love is good, but couldn't he just as easily have said hate is good? Yeah, sure, God says forgiveness and mercy are good, but couldn't God just as easily have said hatred and selfishness are good? Like if it's just coming from God, he could have just picked whatever he wanted. He could have said these things are good and these things are bad, and it's arbitrary. So how can it be trustworthy just because God says it's good? And the other option is if these are good, if good and bad things exist apart from God, and he's just telling us what they are, then that means that God is actually subject to the good and bad things. Like they're higher than God. And God is just telling us what these things are so that we follow him, but he doesn't have any control over them because they exist outside of him. So how can we then trust that these things are good and bad? So Euthyphro is like, which way does this go? And they go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Well, here's what's interesting. Is the Christian response to this is actually that there's a third option. Yes, sure, God does tell us to do things that are good, but they're not arbitrary, the things that he picks. The things that he tells us that are good for us to do, he tells us they are good and we can trust they are good because they are a reflection of his own character. They model his own stance and his own nature and his own existence. In other words, the idea of a God is that it's a perfectly morally good being. And so God cannot tell you to do something that is contrary to his nature. So in other words, if God is morally perfect, right? In order to be God, you got to be morally perfect. You got to be all-knowing. You got to be all-powerful. You've got to be outside of time. You have to be able to choose when to create things like this. So you have to be morally perfect. So God can't tell people to do something evil because that's contrary to his nature. It would mean that he's no longer morally perfect because he's telling people to do evil things. So in other words, whatever God does tell us to do is a good thing because it is in line with somebody who is morally perfect. So when God says to be merciful, it's because he is mercy itself. He is the goodness himself. When he says to be kind, it's because God is kindness himself. It is his nature. It is his essence. Kindness is of him. When God tells us to be loving, it's because God is love himself. So we can trust the things that he tells us that are good because they're in line with a perfectly good God. That's why I can follow the moral rules of the Bible, is because I know that they come from a source that is perfectly good. And if ever I have to question his moral goodness, it would then make sense for me to question the commands that he tells me to do. So something is morally good or bad because it's God's nature. And because he wants us to do it, that means it is a thing we ought to do. Whatever we believe impacts our lives, friends. What you believe impacts your life, and what you believe impacts my life. Oftentimes, what I see people do, in conclusion here, is just that they say, look, I like so many things about Christianity, but I just don't like your God. So I'm going to move the God piece to the side, and I'm going to take this part and this part and this part and this part. But what that tells me is that in rejecting Christianity, they don't have a coherent view of their own, which is why they're selecting this and adding it on to their view, because their view doesn't give a credible stance on its own. So they borrow these ideas from Christianity. The question I would ask anybody is, to where would you go once you walked away from Christianity? To where would you go when you said, I no longer believe this is true, or if you say, I won't even consider if it's true? Where are you now landing? And what does your worldview tell you that helps your life to make sense and helps you to know that you've landed in the area of truth? this is where it's helpful for Christians that are listening to this to be aware, because it should help them to understand how they can talk to people who are not Christians and who are trying to sort through these things. Help them to know that, yeah, I know it can be confusing for you sometimes, but let me tell you where I land and where I understand things. And this kind of disorientation and borrowing from different beliefs and creating our own beliefs that so many non-Christians find themselves in is actually should fuel somebody as a Christian to be able to want to reach out to them and to help answer questions and help them process through these stages and the stage of life that they're in. And so we all need to ask ourselves, we may not always like everything that God says, but what is better out there? To where would you go? And to what will you then believe?